Hi everyone, welcome back to another video, and I know it's been a while since we've done a pre-recorded video, but on Talk Heathen we've had multiple callers talking about intelligent design and believing that the human body is an example of good engineering and that is evidence for intelligent design. And it's very easy to think that if you don't look too hard at the human body, because I can think of a few examples off the top of my head about why the human body is actually kind of a mess. And there are a few flaws with it that I would like to go in detail about. So we're starting the series about why the human body actually sucks. And we're starting off today with the elbow joint because it seems like this very insignificant joint, but if you really look into it, there are some design flaws that might not be there if it were to be intelligently engineered. So before we get into the elbow too far, we're going to talk about the classes of levers because we really need to know why the elbow sucks as much as it does. So we have three different classes of levers, and we're going to go through them kind of one by one and talk about the mechanical advantages and disadvantages of these classes of levers. So class 1 levers are what you consider to be your seesaw. So each of these different levers is based on the position of the fulcrum with regard to the position of the load and the force of effort. So in a class 1 lever, this is your seesaw problem. You have your fulcrum in between the effort and the load. So I have two examples of a class 1 lever here, one that has more mechanical advantage and one with less mechanical advantage. So we know that if you have a seesaw, you have a fulcrum in the middle, you have, let's say you put a giant rock or you put a small child on one side and that is your load, and then you go and you sit on the other side opposite of the fulcrum. You should, if the load is small enough and your force overcomes the force of the load, you can lift it off the ground. And this is actually a lot easier if the fulcrum is closer to the load. If you have more room on the seesaw between you and the fulcrum, and then less arm on the side of the small child, it's easier to sit on the seesaw and lift the child from that side. So that would give you a greater mechanical advantage, and you can calculate this out, but for sake of time, we're not going to calculate out every single lever in their mechanical advantage. But if you look at the other one, this isn't the least advantageous type of class 1 lever, but it's less advantageous than the one that we just saw. So this one has the fulcrum exactly in the middle between the effort and the load. So with the distance of effort being equal to the distance of the load, it's going to have less advantage than if you were to have more arm on the effort side. And this is because force and the torque of this lever is related to the radius. The radius is going to matter here. So going into class 2 levers. Class 2 levers are the best kind of lever you can use in terms of mechanical advantage, and this is our wheelbarrow. If you think of a wheelbarrow, you have the fulcrum that is the wheel, and then you have the load that is in the wheelbarrow kind of bucket, and then the effort is you lifting the handles on the far side of the wheelbarrow. So the load is in between the effort and the fulcrum. So you can put all of the force pretty much onto this fulcrum, and then you have very little to do when you're lifting it up. And again here, moving the load is going to have an impact on the distance and therefore an impact on the mechanical advantage. So let's imagine you're using a wheelbarrow and you put the load right at the bottom, right above the fulcrum. It's going to be very easy for you to lift that wheelbarrow because that force is pretty concentrated around the fulcrum. However, if I were to move the rock or whatever that's in my wheelbarrow and glue it or find some way to adhere it to the top right near my hands, it's going to be a lot harder to lift because that force is going down right kind of where my hands are. So you're going to have less mechanical advantage with that load placement versus if the load is placed at the bottom of the wheelbarrow. So both class 1s and class 2 levers are pretty useful in a lot of situations, but there's a third class of lever, and this is seen to be the worst type of lever that you can use, and we're gonna actually calculate out why this one is so terrible. But a class 3 lever is different from the other two because now what happens is we have the fulcrum on one side, but then we have the effort load the effort force is in between the load and the fulcrum. So this is an example. It's very similar to my arm, and this is where we're going with this lecture. So, and there are a couple ways again to make this more or less advantageous. So if you have, let's say, you have a piece of wood on a fulcrum, you taped it to some kind of pivot, and then you put a rock on the one side, and you stand over the wood, and you lift it up right in front of you. And that's going to have a pretty decent advantage for a class 3 lever for it being so terrible. You can see how you'd have a lot more work to do with that kind of setup versus the wheelbarrow setup. But if you stand closer to the load and pull on it right there versus if you stand way back at the fulcrum that you made and try to lift near the base, you're going to have a lot harder time lifting that load. So the funny thing is, actually, I will show you this next picture before we come back to this picture. But the human elbow, as easily as I can say it, the human elbow sucks. It sucks. So let's draw out the elbow, and especially the action of the biceps brachii, which is going to be our elbow flexor and our primary effort in this case. So I don't have the humerus drawn here. You would normally see the humerus up on the side by the fulcrum. But you have the fulcrum, which is your elbow joint, and then you have your arm, and then you have a load here. And you'll notice that the biceps connects to the forearm past the elbow joint, but very close. So it's not all the way out to your wrist. It's not even halfway between the elbow and the wrist, but it's pretty close to the elbow, but it's still between the elbow and the hand. So we have here the less advantageous, the worst type of the worst type of lever. So not only do we not have a class 1 lever, we don't have a class 2 lever, we have a class 3 lever, and we have the worst type of class 3 lever. And I'm going to show you why this sucks so much. So I did a lot of math ahead of time so that we don't have to go through all of it, but we will go over this picture really quickly, establish kind of our definitions here, and then we will do these calculations. So we have the load, which is let's say it's a rock or a ball in our hand, and we're trying to hold it steady. This is an isometric contraction. We're not trying to lift it at all. All we're trying to do is prevent our hand from falling back down to the ground. So when you're bicep curling, if you ever bicep curl and you hold a weight in your hand that's too heavy, you might for a while be able to hold it still in your hand, but if it's way too heavy for your biceps to lift, your hand's just going to kind of go towards the ground. You're not going to be able to keep your arm bent. So we're trying to think of here a situation of equilibrium. So you're not engaging in an eccentric contraction. You're not losing control of this weight. All we're doing is you're holding it still. You're also not curling it. You're holding it still as if your arm is bent and you're not trying to move it. So in this case, we have the biceps pulling up as our effort force, and we have our load in the hand, and we have the fulcrum, which is our elbow. So if we label these out, let's give a little example. You are holding a 5-kilogram rock or weight or whatever you have. So 5 kilos, kind of close to 10 pounds, roughly. And then we also have to take into account, remember, the weight of the arm, because not only are you pulling up on this weight or holding onto this weight, you have to counteract the weight of the actual arm, the skin, the bone, etc. We don't have an exact measurement here. We're just going to roughly estimate the arm to be 4 kilos. So we have a combined weight there of 9 kilos, but we have different distances from the fulcrum. So we're going to calculate these forces separately. So I've also estimated here some distances between each of these items. So the distance of effort. So this is the distance between the fulcrum and the effort force, which is going to be DE. I have labeled as 4 centimeters because that is pretty close to accurate for most people. We're going to say that the distance of the arm, so the distance to the center of mass on the on the arm is going to be 17 centimeters. So from this fulcrum out to the center of mass, 17 centimeters. And then we are calling the distance of the load from the fulcrum all the way out to the center of mass of the weight is going to be 34 centimeters. So using those defined terms for the equation, what we need to do is we need to figure out the forces of the arm and of the load, taking into account their center of mass and the acceleration of gravity. And then we have to counteract those forces with the force of effort. And so this is a torque question, a torque and equilibrium question. So with this isometric contraction, the goal is that our torque is 0. So if we are holding this steady, no torque is happening by this lever arm. It's staying in place, so torque is 0. So easy peasy for our equation there. So torque, if we're going to calculate it, is equal to the force perpendicular times the distance. And we're simplifying this a lot because I know that the biceps is not actually a perpendicular force. It has an angle that we would have to calculate out in a different equation. But to simplify this and to just make the point easier to get across, we are pretending as if the biceps is pulling straight up. So the torque is going to be equal to the force times the distance. And so we're going to need to do some calculations here. If we calculate out our force of the load and the force of the arm, so the force done by the weight in the hand, we have 5 kilograms times 9.81, or the acceleration due to gravity. That's going to give us 49.05 newtons of force on the hand. And then the force of the arm by gravity is going to be 4 kilos times 9.81, giving us 39.24 newtons. So then we plug those into our equation. We get our torque is going to be equal to the effort force times the distance of the effort. And we're going to subtract the force of the load times the load distance, and then subtracts the force of the arm times the arm distance. And these are going to be negative, of course, because we have the forces of these going negative, and it doesn't really matter which one you assign as negative. You can assign the downward force as negative, or you can assign the upward force as negative. All that matters is that the force of effort is opposite of the force of the arm and the load, because we are showing two different directions of these forces. So it's easier for me to define these as negative. So we have those as subtracted there in the equation. So plugging back in our 0 for torque, if we're solving for 0 and we're solving for this force of exertion, we get some more steps, and I'll just quickly go through these for you. But we end up with 23.34 Newton meters divided by 0.04 meters for the distance of exertion. And we're going to get a force of effort of 589.7 newtons. So look real quick at the combined force of the arm. So even taking the force of the load that we started with is 49.05. So not too much force being done, but look at that force, 589.7 newtons being done by the biceps. So let's calculate out the mechanical advantage. So if we have the mechanical advantage being the force that of the output divided by the force of the input, you get 88 newtons divided by roughly 590 newtons. That gives us a mechanical advantage of 0.149. So this force exerted by the biceps is 6 times the force of the arm and of the load in the hand. So it requires a lot of force to even hold that steady in your hand. Remember, we were not curling it. We were just holding it in our hand. And this is a 10-pound weight, roughly. So just to hold 10 pounds in your hand, you're going to have to exert 589 newtons of force. So are we really that intelligently designed if it takes so much more effort just to do something simple? And I know that someone might say, well, we sacrificed stability for mobility. And that's true. We did. But the fact is, if we were so intelligently designed and if this machine was working to the best of how the design could be, you could argue that there are plenty of other ways that you could design this lever. And if you were to be a perfect, all-knowing deity that can do whatever you want, why not make a situation where you could have mobility and stability? Or is that outside the realm of what is possible for an all-powerful deity? I don't know. But either way, if this designer was intelligent and designed us this way with a sucky elbow joint, then I don't know. Maybe I just don't understand God's ways or his plan, but the human body kind of sucks. And next time we'll talk more about different types of things like metabolism and why that sucks. Maybe we'll talk about the eye and why that sucks. But I hope that this made sense. Let me know if you have any questions. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.